I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 37 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Pursuant to 108 subsection 2 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, February 12th, 2026, the committee commences its study of the security situation in the Balkans. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the standing orders. Members are attending in person in the room, and others are joining us remotely using the Zoom application. I would now like to welcome our witnesses from the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, Jessica Blitt, Ambassador of Canada to Croatia and Kosovo. Welcome. Michelle Cameron, Ambassador of Canada to Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, and Galit Dobner, Director General, Arctic, Eurasian, and European Affairs. We also have Francois Lafreniere, Ambassador to Hungary, Slovenia, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, joining us by video conference. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions from members of the committee. I now invite Ms. Dobner to make an opening statement of no more than 5 minutes. Welcome. Thank you.
Great. Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today on the security situation in the Western Balkans. My remarks will cover three elements. So first, the security situation. Second of all, the role of NATO and the European Union. And third, Canada's contribution to regional peace and security. So on security, while there has been important progress, the Western Balkans do remain structurally fragile. The region continues to be affected by unresolved ethnic disputes, weak institutions, corruption, organized crime, and malign external influence, particularly from Russia, which seeks to exploit divisions and slow Euro-Atlantic integration. So a possible flashpoint remains the relationship between Kosovo and Serbia. The EU-facilitated dialogue between Belgrade and Pristina has lost momentum, and tensions in northern Kosovo remain unresolved. Although the current situation is relatively calm, serious incidents in recent years, including, you will have noted, the September 2023 attack in Banjska, demonstrate how quickly the security situation could shift. In Serbia, there's been growing internal strains over the last 18 months. The Novi Sad rail station tragedy back in November 24 triggered a sustained protest movement over accountability, corruption, and democratic governance. And this is relevant not only as a domestic issue, but also because instability can weaken regional resilience. L'incapacité persistante du Kosovo.
Kosovo's persistent inability to form a stable government, a situation that has now lasted for a year and a half, has led to a serious political crisis marked by repeated elections. The next one is going to be on the 7th of June, and a continuous reliance on caretaker governments. This institutional paralysis has increased the risks of instability at national and regional levels. Bosnia and Herzegovina remains the most fragile post-conflict state in the region. The Dayton Agreement, signed 30 years ago, remains the foundation of peace, sovereignty, and the multi-ethnic character of Bosnia and Herzegovina. But the country is vulnerable to secessionist rhetoric, inter-ethnic tensions, institutional paralysis, and challenges to its constitutional order. International oversight remains essential, particularly through the High Representative and the Peace Implementation Council, in which Canada plays an active role. In contrast, Albania remains a relative anchor of stability in the region, even as it continues to combat corruption. North Macedonia remains generally stable, but its path towards the EU continues to be hampered by disputes with Bulgaria. Montenegro remains the most advanced EU accession candidate in the Western Balkans, but it continues to face challenges related to organized crime, corruption, and public safety.
Both remain indispensable to regional stability. NATO provides the region's most visible hard security architecture. Albania, Montenegro, and North Macedonia are all fellow NATO allies. Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia are partners, and Kosovo continues to aspire to deeper Euro-Atlantic integration, albeit with uneven progress. NATO's KFOR mission remains central to maintaining a safe and secure environment in Kosovo and freedom of movement for all communities. It currently numbers around 4,600 troops from allied and partner countries, and its continued presence reflects the reality that normalization is still incomplete. The European Union is equally important here, both as a security actor and as the region's main long-term anchor for enlargement reforms. It promotes stability through diplomatic engagements, mediation, and rule of law instruments. It leads the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. It runs EU4 Althea in Bosnia and Herzegovina to maintain a safe and secure environment. And it also deploys its rule of law mission EULEX in Kosovo. That said, slow or uneven progress towards accession reforms can create frustration and leaves space for destabilizing actors. On Canada's contribution, finally, our engagement in the Western Balkans is longstanding and I'm sure well known and appreciated by everyone here. Canada played a major role in the region during and after the conflicts of the 90s, with 40,000 Canadian Armed Forces serving in Bosnia and Herzegovina and the broader region, and with 23 Canadians losing their lives in the cause of peace. Today, Canada continues to contribute in practical and targeted ways. In Kosovo, we've had a presence in KFOR and support defense capacity building through training and advisory cooperation. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, Canada remains active through the Peace Implementation Council Steering Board, and we support programming there on rule of law, governance, and resilience to foreign interference. In Albania, Canada supports defense and security cooperation through NATO engagement, demining, and stockpile reduction efforts, as well as broader programming on democracy, cybersecurity, and public sector professionalization. Chair, honorable members, the central point is this: the Western Balkans is more stable than in the past, but this stability cannot be taken for granted. The region still faces unresolved political disputes, democratic fragility, organized crime, and foreign interference. Continued engagement by NATO, the European Union, and partners like Canada is essential to preventing backsliding, strengthening institutions, and advancing a more secure and durable peace. Thank you very much, and we look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you for your statement. We now open the floor for questions, beginning with MP Michael Chong. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing. You mentioned in your opening comments foreign interference. Could you speak to that and the role that the Russian Federation or the People's Republic of China may play in foreign interference activities? And then secondly, can you speak more broadly to the role that they're playing in the region, both of those states?
Yeah. Mr. Chair, thank you very much, the member, for this question. On foreign interference, look, I think the Russians are doing in the Western Balkans what the Russians do everywhere. They have a playbook. That playbook includes things like disinformation, right down the spectrum to hybrid techniques. And I think they're using those same tactics and techniques in the Western Balkans that they use elsewhere. They obviously do not support transatlantic integration and don't want to see the countries of the Western Balkans accede to the European Union. So I think their goals are quite clear. And I think evolving as they do, their tactics are also well known to us. In terms of the roles that they play in the region, I think China obviously has very clear security and economic interests in the Western Balkans, as it does throughout the world, and I think it's pursuing those interests aggressively. I think the Belt and Road Initiative, quite clear how that's playing out. In terms of Russia, we've seen a dependence on Russian energy over time. That is something that we are working with Western Balkans to try to shift. We'd like to see that shift, and I think there's a lot of commitment there to change that dependence in the relationship.
On the issue of Russia, I understand that Serbia is quite reliant on Russian oil and gas. Can you speak a little bit about what measures are being taken by the government and by other Western governments to shift Serbia's reliance away from Russian oil and gas?
So maybe I would just turn to my colleague, or hello, it's the mirror image, my colleague response, the ambassador to Serbia for Canada.
Yes, particularly since the U.S. Enacted sanctions against Gazprom and Gazprom Neft, which own 56% of Serbia's oil and gas company, which was in January, a year and a half ago. Serbia, Canada, and its Western partners have really put a concerted effort, even more so. There's a lot more willingness now to look at divesting from the dependence on Russian oil and gas.
Is there any discussion from the Canadian side about taking advantage of new LNG facilities that are coming online? There's recent news about Germany in discussions with Canada.
To be quite frank, we have had the discussions. The issue is getting the LNG from some of the ports up into Serbia. So, they're working really hard and diligently on building their infrastructure, but that could be a barrier to have an LNG port and then to be able to transport it to Serbia. But we have been talking about all kinds of clean and green energies, from solar panels, slight a bit on LNG. We've also connected Serbia with Canada's nuclear industry. So we're looking at the breadth. The EU is also looking at some more temporary and medium-term measures. So we're all kind of banding together to help Serbia reduce its dependency and eliminate its dependency on Russian oil and gas, which, quite frankly, is a lever that can be used.
Which of you is responsible for Montenegro? Okay, so I'm going to ask you a question about Montenegro. I understand that Montenegro has taken on a significant amount of debt from the People's Republic of China related to infrastructure development. Can you speak a bit about that and what concerns Canada has about that?
Yeah, and I think Canada's concerns are the same as those as the EU and Montenegro itself, quite frankly. So Montenegro, as it's grown, it has taken on a lot of Chinese debt. I think at the end of 2024, we were between 15 and 16% of their external debt was to China. And that was mostly used to do infrastructure projects so that they could also join up with the EU quite quickly.
Are those infrastructure projects viewed as part of the BRI initiative?
Slightly, yeah, yes. Most of them. Yeah. More or less. I guess there's a lot of nuances there, but yeah, more or less. And a lot of those infrastructure projects, they were won competitively. So these were launched either by international development banks, the government of Montenegro itself, or others, and they were won competitively.
Do you suspect that the PRC sold below market prices in order to win the bid?
Privy to the internal bidding.
Yeah. So what concerns do the EU member states and does the EU and Canada have more broadly about the BRI or this issue of Montenegro and its?
Anytime we see one country beholden to another in a debt fashion, we have concerns, right? Because that's a lever that can be used to, you can leverage that into perhaps activities that we're not aligned with or we don't think is in the best interest of another country. And so this is just another example of that.
Just back to the Russian Federation, in Canada, the threat coming from the Russian Federation is almost exclusively in the form of disinformation operations. That clearly is the case in the Balkans as well, but there was reference by Ms. Dobner about full spectrum. So maybe you could speak a bit about what Russia is doing in the Baltics in terms of other forms of foreign interference.
Yeah, sure. So just to clarify what I was saying, I think Russia has a clear playbook, and I think it uses that playbook around the world. That's what we've seen. So I think it depends on the moment. I think we are seeing right now, as a result of Russia's illegal war in Ukraine, how the Russians are taking advantage of that and using hybrid techniques to respond. And so I don't think that the Balkans, sit outside of that activity.
Thank you. Next, we have MP Van den Beld. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you very much for being here and for your testimony. As you may know, this is a topic that's of significant interest to me. And I want to start with Ms. Dobner. You talked about the fact that while it is relatively stable right now, we cannot take that stability for granted. And I'm thinking particularly about Kosovo and Bosnia. And I realize that in an era where there is increasing geopolitical competition and strife, and in a region where it is literally a fault line along that geopolitical influence, especially with Russia's, it's illegal invasion of Ukraine and increasing aggression. This is a region that Canada, at the moment, historically, you mentioned with our peacekeepers, with civilian peacekeepers, democracy, there was a tremendous amount of Canadian involvement. And about 15 to 20 years ago, there was a decision as Canada was looking at targeting more geographically where we could have the best influence. It was decided that this was an area that was really Europe's backyard and that Europe was able to handle it. We moved from OSCE primarily to the EU missions. Things have changed. We are now looking at much greater Euro-Atlantic integration. The Prime Minister has made it clear that we want to have security and economic ties, greater ties with Europe. And yet in the region, our presence really in the last decade or so has not been significant. And one of the reasons is, you mentioned NATO, but OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which has field missions in all around the region, people present in place, and it is targeted on economic and security issues. There are no senior Canadians because, as far as I understand, when OSCE hires people, they pay the per diem, the institution, but the country from which that person originates pays the salary. And if I'm not mistaken, for the last 18 years, Canada has refused to pay any salaries for any people who are seconded to OSCE, meaning the only presence we have in all of these missions are young interns who just want experience or, people who don't care about not getting paid, which means that other countries like the U.S. are trying strategically to get positions within OSCE in strategic places, and Canada is really absent. I wonder if there's been any discussion about reversing that policy to not second to OSCE and to perhaps agree to actually pay salaries for Canadians who are hired by OSCE.
So, Mr. Chair, I just want to thank the member for this great question. As was said, the OSCE staffs its missions through contracted personnel and through secondments, and folks who are seconded to OSCE missions in the field are then paid through a set of per diems that allow for housing and board. When Canadians apply for secondment to these missions, the Government of Canada makes clear if it's not in a position to provide a salary. I think it's important to underline the Government of Canada doesn't have a secondment platform where it can systematically second to international organizations like the OSCE. It happens, and it happens on an ad hoc basis. And absolutely, it's been an issue of discussion for the Department of Foreign Affairs, Global Affairs Canada, and it continues to be an issue of discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Are we the only country that doesn't pay for secondments?
Look, I'm sorry, I'll undertake to get a response for you. I don't lead on the OSCE, but I'm happy to get a response from you from the leads in our department.
But you would agree that because it is an unpaid, essentially per diem only, that we aren't getting the senior level, like the heads of mission, deputy heads of mission. There have not been any real senior level Canadians in OSCE in the last decade.
So look, I'd have to undertake to get a response to you on that two-part question. I'm happy to do that.
Thank you. And on the same vein, when I was in Kosovo, there was a Canadian office, and it subsequently has been closed. I know there's been talk over the years of having, an honorary representative, envoy, small office, something. Canada right now, if you look at other countries, certainly the United States, the presence there is significant, and Canada having zero presence diplomatically. I wonder if there's any discussion about having some kind of a representative or envoy or small office in Kosovo.
Again, I want to thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question from the member. Look, I think it's important to say here that Canada is absolutely committed to peace and stability and security in Europe and in the Western Balkans. And historically, and we've talked about that today, Canada's played an outsized role in blood and in treasure in promoting peace and stability in the region. We're still very active in a lot of different ways. So, for instance, Canada is one of 11 members of the Peace Implementation Committee Steering Board responsible for Bosnia and Herzegovina. We do a lot of military capacity building for countries in the region. We do programming to support governance and rule of law through various instruments that we have here in Ottawa and at mission level. So we absolutely do what we can. In terms of coverage for Kosovo, we're lucky to have an incredibly competent ambassador who covers Kosovo, but covers Kosovo from Croatia. We don't have right now, we don't have embassies across all countries in the world, so we have to cover some countries from other capitals. And so we rely on those missions to be our eyes and ears. And I know that our ambassador Kosovo travels there consistently, reports in, and represents Canada.
Thank you. Next is MP Duceppe. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Dubner, I adore your title, Director General, Arctic, Eurasian and European Affairs. I hope I have that long title one day, but you have a lot of work before you with the work you're doing. In the briefing note that was presented to Minister Annan when she was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs in 2025, there was no mention made of the Balkans. To what extent is this a priority for the department when you look at Canada's foreign affairs policy, the Balkans? Because no mention is made of that. However, it's a central zone when you look at lots of geopolitical movements going on. Once again, thank you for the question. That's a very good question.
Saying that, as I've just previously stated, Canada is still very much active in supporting peace, stability, and security in the Western Balkans. Has our focus shifted since the 90s and the early 2000s when the security situation was most acute in the region? Yes. Canada, of course, doesn't have infinite resources, and of course we focused our resources to support Europe's eastern flank. So our presence in Latvia right now, for example, through the multinational NATO brigade that is there, and our support that we're providing to Ukraine, where we judge that the situation is most acute. So there's no doubt that Canada provides less support than we have in the past, but I would also say that the region has evolved, and I would also say that with NATO and EU missions in place in the Western Balkans and the Europeans actively working with countries in the Western Balkans on their accession, that there is probably less need for Canada to play a role than it did in the past.
Je comprends très bien, mais quand même.
I understand. However, given the geographic situation of the Balkans and all that is happening with the external forces, we talked about Russia and China, and in a context where, geopolitically speaking, there's significant movement, it should have been part of the briefings presented to the minister, but you are saying that priorities have changed, interests have changed when it comes to the Balkans when compared to the past.
To address that question, has the Minister of Foreign Affairs briefed on the situation in the Western Balkans? Absolutely. Just because that briefing was not part of the book to which the member refers, it doesn't mean the minister isn't actively briefed on the Western Balkans. I can certainly attest to the minister being briefed on that and preparing lots of products for her. So I just want you to rest assured that it's a region that Canada obviously pays a great deal of attention to, and our political leaders are briefed on regularly.
Il y a aussi eu une reconnaissance du Kosovo.
Kosovo was quickly recognized by Canada, and that was commended by many of our allies as well. What did the Canadian government rely on when it wanted to recognize Kosovo as a country? what criteria were relied on, because when we recognize a new country, a country says it has become independent, there should be some criteria relied on by the government. So what criteria were relied on?
Contente de répondre.
I'll be happy to answer your question. When this happened, this was an important context following the war, following the intervention. Canada was very active during that period, and we recognized the importance of managing Kosovo as part of Euro-Atlantic integration. We understood that it was important for Kosovo to be part of the international community as a country. We also had significant ties with Kosovo during the war afterwards. There were refugees that came in, and democracy had started and was going to move forward. So it was a situation that had to be managed. I understand, besides the fact that we had relations with Kosovo, there's always a way of acceding to independence, and it requires recognition, international recognition of a country. When I talk about criteria, I'm talking about the means for the country to accede to independence. People are speaking very loudly, and it's difficult for me to continue this conversation. I'm sorry. When it's time to recognize a country internationally, what criteria are used by Canada to recognize such a country, looking at the means the country used to get independence? Do you understand me?
If I may, Mr. Chair, look, it's not every day that Canada recognizes a new country, so we just have to say we don't have a fixed, and I apologize, I don't mean that in a flippant way at all, but we don't have a sort of a fixed set. It's a great question. We don't have a fixed set of criteria. I'd say that it's case by case because it's something that's fairly unique and specific to the circumstance. So I wouldn't be able to identify for you a sort of a set of criteria that are...
Donc, personne ici qui peut répondre à ma question.
So there's no one here who can answer my question. What are the criteria? When Canada recognizes a new country, what criteria are used by Canada to recognize the country? So in spite of your senior positions, there's no one here who can answer the question. Point of order, Mr. Chair. We have experts on the Balkans, not necessarily experts on how a country is recognized when it gains independence. As Ms. Dobner just said, this is not something that happens every day. Clearly, it's a topic of interest to our colleagues on the other side, but maybe they could find someone who can provide answers to that question. So if the people here cannot answer the question, Mr. Chair, I'll respond to my colleague who I appreciate very much, who gives me a lot of time during question period. When you are ambassador in a given region and you are not able to provide the criteria that leads to recognizing a country where we work, I find that particular or peculiar. What you're saying is that no one was able to answer.
It's allotted, so we'll go to the next person. MP Ziad Abul Taif, you have 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Welcome, ambassadors and director. Michelle, good to see you again after 10 years. Canada's legacy in the region was since Major General Lou Mackenzie, 1992-93, was the first commander of United Nations Protection Forces. That legacy left a big responsibility on Canada to carry forward the role in the region, although we have many players, Russia, China, and in the surrounding area. Balkans always been a place where conflict take place and become a concern, not just for the region, but obviously for the world. So if we were to assess the situation now, compared to 10 years ago, how do you see that? Maybe, Michelle, you can take on this view.
Look, I think I'll start with, first, Chair, I'd like to thank the honourable member for the question. Look, you're right, Canada does have such a strong legacy, whether we look at military development, humanitarian assistance, political engagement in the region. And a testament to that is the number of Serbian Canadians or other folks from the region that we have here in Canada. I mean, that was a testament to sort of our humanitarian side of things. When we look at our engagement over the years, as Ms. Dobner had said, we have shifted our priorities, and we don't ignore our history. We're proud of it. The region is proud of it. But there are times when you have to realize where your core competencies can be leveraged. Not to say that they can't be in the Western Balkans, but when we look at all the geopolitical challenges of our time and across the world, and we do continue through a variety of means over the last 10 years. So even if you take a look at strict numbers, as you see a drawdown in some of our troops and in some of our programming, I think over the last 10 years we've engaged very strategically.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président. Ça fait pendant
Point
que
of order, Chair. While I was speaking and asking questions a while ago, I was distracted by discussions from the other side of the room. It's the first time this is happening to me. Now, questions are being asked by the Conservative Party, and I find this disrespectful towards the witnesses. If you want to have private conversations, please leave the room. This is the first time this is happening in this committee. This is happening more than once. If you are not interested, please leave the room. The witnesses came here for us.
Have understood your point.
And so I'll focus on Serbia, and then I'll pass the floor to Ms. Dobner to add anything regionally. But look, we've continued very specific and targeted programming to enhance, to encourage their human rights records across the region, to encourage democratic reforms. We have lent our voices to EU and other Western countries that have other carrots and sticks in the region to use. We've done very targeted advocacy, and so I think we've used the tools in our toolkit as we pivot or reprioritize some of our resources. But we really have, over the last 10 years, really used targeted tools to assist in their democratic reforms. And maybe Ms. Dobner wants to add for a more broader view of the region.
Yes. As I understood the question, part of the question was about how the situation in the Western Balkans itself has evolved over the last 10 years. And I would say we have seen enormous strides in this region. It's pretty incredible that 3 of those 6 countries in the Western Balkans are now members of NATO, so fellow allies of Canada, and that many are on their path to EU accession. There is this committee hearing is very propitious because there is an EU-Balkans summit this week to discuss that very fact. Montenegro has now opened each one of its 27 chapters for EU accession, and I think 27, and has closed 7 of those. So I think the progress in the region is undeniable. Do parts of the region remain fragile? Yes. Do there continue to be challenges with corruption, with interethnic disputes, with foreign interference? Yes, yes, and yes. But I don't think that any of that should belie the fact that there has been enormous progress in the Western Balkans.
I just have a quick
over the
question.
last
The
decade.
memory of the institutions of the communist era, still, we got to believe that still play a role in the instability of the region. How Canada is monitoring that, if we are, and would you think that impact still exists?
So, look, I spoke a little bit in my opening remarks about weak institutions, and we absolutely monitor this and report on this. I count on our rich network of ambassadors across the region who report regularly back to headquarters so that we remain current on the state of affairs. And then we use various levers that we have, whether it's diplomatic, the discussions that we have at all levels, but also programmatic. So we have funding envelopes within our peace operations program at headquarters. We have funding envelopes at missions, albeit modest, but are used strategically to catalyze projects working with civil society on rule of law, governance, human rights, thank you very much. That's an important one. Foreign interference. So we use all the levers at our disposal to try to address these challenges.
Thank you very much. Monsieur Guilbeault, you have 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, guest, for being here today on this very important topic. if I understood you well when you responded to Mr. Chung a while ago, we've seen a lot of Russian influence in the region. I understand that this influence is expressed in many ways, particularly culturally. And the first time I was Minister of Canadian Heritage, I had a very important discussion with the Minister of Culture from Ukraine, who was very interested in what we refer to as Bill C-10, that has become Bill C-11, an amendment of the Broadcasting Act. Now, about ensuring that web giants be obligated to add Quebec and Canadian content. And he found that very interesting because we were doing that in Canada to protect ourselves from the American giants. And they said, we have two giants, the Americans and the Russian giants on the other side. And I wonder whether one of Canada's contributions will not be to work with some of these governments to share our experience on the matter and also use such mechanisms as safeguards. It will not resolve all problems of Russian influence, but it may at least resolve some of the problems. Thank you.
For what's a really interesting suggestion. That's a great recommendation. It's not something that we have thought through a great deal, but we will absolutely take that back. So I want to thank the member for the valuable suggestion.
Je pourrais parler à mon ami.
I could talk to my friend, the Minister of Culture and Identity, to suggest that he has a conversation with you. Now, in your opinion, is there something else that a country like Canada could do to counter the role of countries like Russia in that region? I know that work is being done at the level of democratic institutions, but is there something else that we could do, something we could add to the toolbox specifically to help the region you represent?
Start with an answer, and then perhaps I'll turn to my colleagues if they'd like to add anything. So, look, Ambassador Cameron talked earlier about reliance on Russian energy, which is real and which is important. And pivoting takes time. And I think our European friends have demonstrated this. I think they've pulled a real rabbit out of the hat in how quickly they have kicked their dependence on Russian energy. But these things happen with time. And I think the degree to which that we can work with countries in the Western Balkans to rid themselves of dependencies such as energy, which is the one that comes, of course, first to mind, but there's other dependencies as well, to help them diversify, will help them in a very practical way, put them in a position to choose their alliances and their partnerships. Ambassadors?
Maybe just very briefly, I think Kosovo is an interesting situation in this regard because they have very firmly taken a Euro-Atlantic position. They are not letting Russia or frankly China either, but they are really not letting Russia in the door. They have aligned with the EU on sanctions, despite, it's a small country, but symbolically they've aligned with the EU on their Russia sanctions, and they have been extremely pro-Ukraine and done very concrete things in that regard, whether it's demining training or support to Ukrainian journalists. So I think it's really interesting to see the way Kosovo, despite being a small country, has really stepped up and sort of shown itself where it wants its alignment to be. Thank you.
And thank you, Honourable Chair. I thank the Honourable Member for the question. In thinking outside of the box in ways that we can combat, this Russian influence in Serbia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, we've taken a look at where Russia plays a niche role. And so we talked a little bit about trying to divest of the oil and gas dependency, but we've also connected educational institutions to kind of give that civic education on anti-disinformation. We have been encouraging companies to come in on the energy sector, IT sector, anywhere that we see Russia getting a foothold. And then we've also launched a few public education campaigns, particularly around, Russian disinformation. There's often a seed of truth. And so Russia likes to celebrate at the end of World War II, they liberated Belgrade. Sometimes they expanded into they liberated Serbia. And we're quick to point out that it was disproportionately Ukrainians who were the troops who came in to liberate. And so by taking a look at where Russia has the hooks in, we've been somewhat successful in being able to rally companies, educational institutions, our public affairs to kind of tackle those. And then, of course, bringing in the wider Western community to also do the same with their assets. So.
Thank you very much. Next, we go to MP Alexis Duceppe. You have 2.5 minutes.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have some friendly advice, Madam. When we are ambassador in a country, in my opinion, it's only logical to know the criteria used to recognize these countries. If you are not able to tell us here in the committee, there's no problem. There's no major stake. But I'd like to say it's important. It's not only important when Bloc Québécois MPs ask you questions. Even when you do your work abroad, it's important to know the criteria that led to the country we represent being recognized. That being said, Ms. Dubner, I would like to know which are the most important entities in terms of disinformation that are now present in the Balkans, because there's a lot of talk about that. Apparently, there are networks using disinformation for political reasons in the Balkans. We've heard about China and Russia as well. Is this something you see and feel? Is Canada taking any measures to fight the disinformation that is reigning in the Balkans?
We addressed the issue of criteria, that it would be impossible to have a fixed set of criteria because each situation would be unique. On the issue of foreign interference, je pense qu'on a...
Pardon, excusez-moi.
I'm sorry. There's no specific criteria for recognizing a country? Is that what you're saying?
Times already, Mr. Chair, is that we don't have a set list of criteria. When there comes to recognizing a new state like Kosovo, this would be something that would be determined on a case-by-case basis.
Mais, si je peux me permettre, ma question était...
If I may, my question was what criteria were used in recognizing Kosovo? I wasn't talking about all countries. I was talking about Kosovo. That was my question. What criteria was used by Canada to recognize the independence of Kosovo?
Information of a historical nature that dates back 20 years about the deliberations at the time when Kosovo was recognized, then I am more than pleased to undertake to go back and provide an answer in writing.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point.
Oui, mais je pense sincèrement que vous devriez être au courant.
Sincerely, I think you should be aware of such things when you occupy the position you occupy.
I think so. The witness has agreed to provide the factors that led to Canada recognizing Kosovo. I think that last comment was not appropriate in my opinion. Anyway, we're out of time for Mr. Duceppe. We'll go next to Madame Rood. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for being here today. Ambassadors, China has already provided substantial financing to most Western Balkan nations through the Belt and Road Initiative, granting Beijing significant economic and political leverage across the region. Consistent with Canada's own Indo-Pacific strategy, which explicitly calls out China as a disruptive global actor and CSIS assesses the assessments of PRC influence operations, what concrete whole-of-government plan is Global Affairs Canada implementing to counter this non-transparent economic statecraft?
Mr. Chair, I want to thank the member. This is a great question. It's a very complicated question. I have to admit that I am not the Director General responsible for China or the Indo-Pacific, and I think that a question about China's strategy writ large would probably be best answered by other experts from our department. So
yes, but I think a question on Chinese influence and activities in this region.
I apologize. Maybe I misunderstood the question. I thought it was a more general question about China's economic strategy. Pardon me if I misunderstood the question.
Global Affairs, what whole of government plan is Global Affairs Canada implementing to counter non-transparent economic stonecraft was the question.
Pardon me, in the Western Balkans, Mr. Chair?
In the Indo-Pacific, in the Western Balkan, most Western
Point
Balkan
d'ordre,
nations.
Monsieur le Président.
No, I actually.
Point
to
of
be-
order, Chair.
She referenced the Indo-Pacific strategy comments about China by the government, and then pivoted from there to say, how do the witnesses view Chinese activities in the Western
Yes,
Balkans?
that is correct.
Okay, so I think that's within the scope.
View China's activities in the Western Balkans?
Sure.
Correct.
Yes.
Great, okay. Thank you for the clarification. I appreciate the scoping here. So look, I think I mentioned earlier, China is active in the Western Balkans as it is around the globe. I think in the Western Balkans, it particularly has a lot of economic interests. Canada has economic interests vis-a-vis China, and we collaborate with China in certain ways, and it is certainly up to the Western Balkans to collaborate with China. I think historically, China has been in a position to provide development, financing to countries that hasn't been available to them from other countries. And so I think thinking about how you provide countries in the Western Balkans with options is important. How we can help them diversify their sources of financing is an important thing that we think about, and I think we need to sharpen our pencils on.
Are we coordinating with NATO allies and actively promoting transparent Western alternatives so that the Euro-Atlantic integration succeeds for every country in the Balkans?
So that's a great question. So absolutely, as we mentioned already, 3 of the countries in the Western Balkans are already members of NATO, and 2 of them have a partnership with NATO. We just saw actually military exercises for the first time between Serbia and NATO just last week, and Canada played a role there as well. So we absolutely work with our fellow NATO allies to promote integration.
Thank you very much. The Western Balkans has emerged as a significant vector for foreign-directed hybrid interference, particularly by Russia, combining cyber operations, disinformation, and the exploitation of local governance and ethnic vulnerabilities alongside the activities of transnational organized crime networks that are increasingly incorporating sophisticated cybercrime capabilities. To what extent does Canada assess the region as a staging ground or platform for cyber attacks, hybrid operations, or criminal enterprises that could directly or indirectly threaten Canadian national security, critical infrastructure, democratic institutions, or economic interests? And what diplomatic capacity building, intelligence sharing, and law enforcement cooperation initiatives are Canadian missions in the Balkans undertaking in coordination with our Five Eyes partners to strengthen resilience in the region and mitigate spillover risks to Canada?
Okay. That was a big question.
It was a big question.
Lots
I'm
to
running out of
unpack
time.
there. Lots to unpack there. So, look, yes, transnational crime is an issue in the region. Yes, foreign interference is an issue in the region. And yes, cybersecurity is also an issue in the region. And I would just note some of the comments I made earlier about the programming, capacity building and programming that Canada's put in place, whether it's through military cooperation and training, whether it's through our Canadian Fund for Local Initiatives available through missions, or whether it's through our peace operations funding. We are trying to address all of these vectors, and we do it in partnership with other like-minded countries in the region. So I would just point to some of that programming.
Thank you. Perfect. We are next going to hear from Braden Clark. You have 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you to all of our witnesses for being here this afternoon. It's been very interesting. Ms. Dobner, you talked in your opening statement about the stability of the region relative to recent history, and well, that's wonderful. I was curious about the domestic political situation in Kosovo. So on Sunday, I believe, they'll be having their 3rd parliamentary elections in less than a year, which is a lot, right? So I'm just curious if you could give us your take on that and what your sense is of the situation there, and for whoever is best situated to address that question.
I'll maybe just turn it over. Thank you
Sure.
very much for the question. I'll turn it over to Ambassador Blitt, who's definitely best positioned to respond.
Thank you. Happy to do so. And thank you to the chair for the honorable member's question. So yes, we are, this Sunday will be the third election since February of last year. So, you know, that is the fact of the matter. The fact of the matter is there have been, the two preceding elections have been free and fair. They've been well run. It's in some ways, it's a sign of democracy that is finding its way. There are institutions that are continuing to grow and continue to build. And so while, you know, some institutional stability, I think, is something that the international community, including Canada, would like to see in Kosovo, certainly to be able to sort of have a stable partner on the ground. The fact of the matter is the way they've gone through these electoral processes have been fully in line with their constitution. There have been a number of situations that have gone to the Constitutional Court. The Constitutional Court has decreed one way or another, and that has led to action. So, you know, I guess I'm a little glass half full, or at least I try to be. Obviously, you know, it would be, Kosovo needs to have a stable government to be able to move forward, also to move forward as a strong partner for the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, which is what we want to see for the overall sort of Euro-Atlantic aspirations of the country. But the fact of the matter is they have been, you know, following the constitutional processes, following their electoral processes. And so we're hoping that that will continue and that we'll have, you know, we expect to have successful elections this weekend, and then we'll be able to move forward from there.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's an excellent answer, right? We all know, all of us around this table know, democracy is messy sometimes, right? And unpredictable, and that's okay, right? That's also a sign of resiliency. So I appreciate that. Ms. Dobner, you mentioned as well the presence of organized crime networks in the region, obviously, as a pernicious effect on the region in general. I'm curious, in your estimation or in your view, are those groups, you know, strictly non-state actors, or are there ties to, you know, foreign states as another means of influence through those criminal organizations?
To foreign states outside of the outside of the region.
Yeah, or inside if there are cases. Yeah.
So look, I think this is a level of detail I'm not sure I'd be able to provide from my vantage point. But of course, organized crime flourishes where institutions are weak. And I talked earlier about corruption, which is not unheard of in the region. So I think to the degree that you have corruption, you usually have some partial elements of state capture. So I imagine, but I wouldn't be able to give you a detailed answer to that question.
You've talked about NATO membership for states in the region, EU accession as well. So it's, as all of you would know very well, if you look at the map of Europe and EU membership, there's a blank spot, right, essentially hovering over the region, although they are in different states of play. So I'm just curious in the last minute or so, and I know it's hard to put you on the spot in a minute, but give us kind of your highlights of where you see in the region work towards EU membership and what that tells you about the stability of the region in general.
Where we are on the path to EU accession,
Yes.
you mean?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, look, I think it goes without saying that Montenegro is the next closest. They have, as I mentioned earlier, opened up all of those chapters and closed some of them already, which is really encouraging. And I think the fact that the president of the EU Council is in town this week and is joining the leaders of the Balkans in a summit is a really strong signal that the European Union is committed to this accession path and to bringing on board Balkan countries. So I think it's really encouraging. I think certain countries in the region still have far to go and need to resolve some of these disagreements amongst themselves and the security situation before they can become EU members. But look, Canada is playing an important role through some of the programming that I spoke about earlier to try to contribute to democracy, human rights, rule of law, which are all the important facets of accession. So overall, we're optimistic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I really want to thank the witnesses for coming and sharing your statements and answering all our questions. We will briefly suspend now to prepare for the next panel. Thank you. I call this meeting to order. Before I introduce our witnesses, I'd like to just get a number of brief items of the committee out of the way so that we can get to the panel. Number one, there's a budget from the Subcommittee on International Human Rights in the amount of $11,700 that was distributed to all members. It's for its study on the human rights of children around the world. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt this budget? Correct. Second, there are two budgets for the committee to consider: security situation in the Balkans study, $10,850, and the supplementary budget for the study of Bill C-219, $1,000. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt these budgets? That's right. So I would take that as a yes. And then finally, I'd like to inform members that we're still working on organizing an informal meeting with the Speaker of the Parliament of Greenland on June 9th at 9 a.m. A confirmation email will be sent from the clerk as soon as those details are confirmed. In the meantime, do members authorize the clerk to incur the necessary hospitality and logistical expenses for the proper conduct of this meeting with the Speaker of the Parliament of Greenland? Agreed? Okay. I would now like to welcome our witnesses for this second hour. Maria Berishaj Silejmani, Gender Equality and Social Inclusion Specialist, joining us by video conference. Welcome. We also have Valerie Percival, Professor, Norman Patterson School of International Affairs, Carleton University. Welcome. And we also have Krenar Rejaj, PhD candidate, Carleton University. Welcome. Up to 5 minutes will be given for opening remarks, after which we'll proceed with rounds of questions. I now invite Ms. Percival to make an opening statement of no more than 5 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair and honorable members of the committee. I really appreciate this invitation to speak to you today on the security situation in the Balkans. I'm going to take a slightly more historical perspective, but I was very interested in the questions that were asked and happy to address more contemporary concerns. So as a vital crossroads between East and West, the Balkans have always served as a bellwether for global peace and security. From the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand that sparked World War I to the wars that led to the dissolution of Yugoslavia and killed tens of thousands of civilians, geopolitical transitions clearly reveal themselves in the Balkans. The history of the region serves as a reminder that preventing conflict is far less costly than fighting wars, and what happens thousands of miles away can deeply impact Canada. We are currently living through another such geopolitical transition. The number of conflicts worldwide is at its highest level since the end of World War II. The scaffolding of the liberal international order, long underpinned by the United States, is under stress and at risk of collapse. Canadian foreign policy is still finding its footing in this shifting landscape. The government's stated objective is to build Canada strong by expanding export markets and building our military strength. But we cannot ensure our security in a more divisive and violent world through military means alone. While the Prime Minister has discussed working together with other middle powers to provide new mechanisms to bolster our economic security, he's provided less clarity on what this means for our foreign policy in places like the Balkans. Earlier in my career, I worked in Kosovo, first for the Canadian government, and later as the director of the International Crisis Group's office in Pristina. This was a time when Canada punched above its weight internationally, making significant contributions to building stability and peace in the region. During the current time of global uncertainty and upheaval, I've been reflecting on what Canadian foreign policy can learn from that era of engagement. What can our experience teach us about how to advance our interests in a complex world? Today, I will share some of those reflections to outline 3 lessons for Canadian policy, born from both our successes and our mistakes in the Balkans. First, Canadian foreign policy is at its best when the government provides a clear sense of direction or purpose, what I refer to as a foreign policy compass. Such a compass should not only reflect Canadian values and interests, but it must also advance our reputation as a country that contributes to peace and stability, while being realistic about Canada's value added as a middle power. During the Balkan conflicts, our foreign policy compass was the human security agenda, centered on the protection of civilians. This compass enabled Canada to quickly respond to the rapidly changing situation on the ground, an environment where our objectives of protecting human rights and promoting security sometimes appeared contradictory. While we must adapt that compass to our new geopolitical realities, we cannot forget our value added and our principles. Second, Canada's contributions to peace and stability in places like Bosnia and Kosovo can have a cascade effect, elevating our global standing and benefiting our broader foreign policy objectives. However, this requires Canada to deliver tangible results rather than rhetorical platitudes. Canada deployed a broad range of coordinated and complementary foreign policy tools in the region. This integrated approach includes diplomatic assets, peacekeeping troops, police, civilian experts, and the rapid disbursement of development assistance to promote security as well as social and economic recovery. Recognizing our limitations as a middle power, we worked through regional and international institutions such as NATO, the OSCE, and the United Nations, while supporting the critically important role of the European Union as the key guarantor for future economic prosperity and stability. Given that preventing conflicts is far less costly than responding to them, we also supported research and advocacy for good governance, conflict prevention, and peace building. And third, a narrow focus on national security is insufficient for managing complex global crises. National security approaches focus on the symptoms rather than the root drivers of conflict, and often underestimate the strategic importance of civilian protection, expert diplomacy, and development and humanitarian assistance. In the Balkans, Canada did not shy away from using our military assets, deploying approximately 40,000 troops to the region over the course of our engagement. These deployments strengthened our own armed forces by providing them with vital real-world training. Crucially, however, the military was not the only voice at the decision-making table. The deployment of military assets was one tool in Canada's broader foreign policy toolbox. So what does this mean for Canada's ability to contribute to the fragile peace in the Balkans today? When promoting the foreign policy objective of Canada Strong, we must be keenly aware that our own security relies on our ability to contribute to a most stable and peaceful world in the Balkans and elsewhere. While security in the Balkans is largely in the hands of our European partners, we can and should provide support where it's needed. We can do more than just sit at the table. We can put forward a clear and coherent agenda. Ultimately, we must carry the lessons of the Balkans forward as we navigate an increasingly complex and conflict-affected global landscape. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now invite Krenare Reshaj to make your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members of the committee for the invitation to speak. My name is Krenare Reshaj, and I am a doctoral candidate at Carleton University and junior fellow at the Bill Graham Center at the University of Toronto. Today I will be discussing what I and numerous experts have identified as one of the most serious security concerns in the Balkans, the lack of normalization of relations between Kosovo and Serbia. I will argue that the West's current approach to this problem is flawed and conclude with recommendations for what Canada's role should be. Since 2013, the governments of Serbia and Kosovo have been engaged in EU-mediated talks backed by the U.S., known informally as the Brussels Agreement, which tie both countries' Euro-Atlantic integration to the normalization of relations between them. The pressure for normalization has intensified since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, as Western leaders seek to prevent another flashpoint in Europe. The most problematic aspect of this renewed push for normalization between these two countries is the extent to which Western actors have accommodated President Vucic's government, treating him as the guarantor of regional stability. Using the example of the Banska terrorist attack of 2023, I argue that this approach of tying Kosovo's European future to normalization with Serbia does not produce stability. It produces the opposite, all the while unjustly holding the citizens of Kosovo's future to the cooperation of a government that continues to perpetuate dangerous nationalist myths and inflame tensions. To understand this example, some context is necessary. Serbia's approach to Kosovo is shaped by nationalist mythology rooted in long-standing history that has been weaponized to justify violence against Albanians, most devastatingly by Milosevic in the 1990s. Crucially, as experts have pointed out, this mythology continues to be perpetuated by Vucic's government today. In September 2023, more than 24 heavily armed Serbian nationalist militants attacked Kosovo police officers in northern Kosovo, killing one. Although Serbia denied any involvement and continues to do so, the government declared a day of national mourning for the 3 attackers who were killed, and state-aligned Serbian media portrayed them as martyrs, explicitly invoking anti-Albanian rhetoric and nationalist mythologies. This response by both the government and state-aligned media reflects the continuation of nationalist rhetoric directed at Albanians and defiance towards the international community. Following this incident, the United States condemned the violence in general terms, but called on both parties equally to refrain from actions that inflame tensions. In doing so, it created a false equivalency. The EU's language was admittedly stronger, with a resolution explicitly stating that Serbian authorities were heavily involved and condemning the use of the attack to spread hostility toward Kosovo Albanians. Yet none of this translated to policy change. The framework tying Kosovo's future to normalization with Belgrade remained intact. Meanwhile, Kosovo has historically been one of the most pro-Western countries in the world. Although this continues to be the case, there is growing frustration among both Kosovo's government and its citizens towards the EU and the United States. It is important to note that this frustration, for the most part, has not been directed at Canada, which has remained largely on the sidelines of the question of normalizations between Serbia and Kosovo. This brings me to my 2 recommendations. First, Canada should use its voice within NATO and multilateral forums to advocate for decoupling Kosovo's Euro-Atlantic integration from normalization with Serbia. Kosovo's citizens, the vast majority of whom simply want security, economic opportunity, and participation in the international community, should not have their future be dependent on the cooperation of a government that glorifies those who attack them. Second, Canada should capitalize on the goodwill it has already earned among the government and people of Kosovo and take concrete steps to deepen its influence and presence in the region so that it's positioned to play a greater and more constructive role. I'm out of time to go into the concrete steps, but I'm happy, Mr. Chair, to address them in questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite Ms. Berishaj Silimani to make an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, and thanks to everybody for inviting me to speak today. My name is Maria Berisha Suleimani, and I'm Gender and Social Inclusion Specialist, working for more than 15 years also in the issue of women, peace, and security. I'm also board member of the Kosovo Women's Network, the largest umbrella organization of the women's NGOs in Kosovo. Today, I would like to speak, among other issues that have been mentioned and are very important and tied to security, regarding the implementation of women, peace, and security agenda in Kosovo and why it remains relevant also to this day. The wars in the Western Balkans during the 90s, including the war in Kosovo, caused immense human suffering and had a profound impact on women and girls. While women were disproportionately affected by the conflict, they also played a critical role in supporting their communities, rebuilding social ties, and contributing to peace and recovery in the whole region. Yet, women were largely absent from formal peace negotiation and post-conflict decision-making processes. This exclusion is precisely what United Nations Security Resolution 1325 seeks to address. It focuses and addresses it through participation, protection, prevention, and recovery, which are the 4 pillars of this resolution. More than 20 years later, Kosovo has made important progress. We heard also the previous speakers in many of the fields, but significant implementation challenges remain regarding the 1325. Women in Kosovo do not only support this agenda through institutions, they live it every day. They lived it also during the war and after the war. Through community mediation, support to survivors, dialogue across communities, and grassroots peace building, they continue to contribute to stability and social cohesion. Kosovo now is in the phase of preparing the new program of gender equality, and it's very important to say that women, peace, and security is one of the main pillars, the third pillar of this new program. Also, civil society organizations, particularly women-led organizations, have played a central role in advocating these advances, providing services, and promoting accountability. There has also been an important progress in recognizing survivors of conflict-related sexual violence who now have access to legal recognition and to institutional support. I have mentioned some of the maybe positive steps that happened in here, but there are also many of the issues that still remain. We need continuous investment to maintain peace in this part of the world, in our Balkans. Kosovo and the wider region continue to face challenges linked to unresolved grievances from the war, incomplete justice for victims, and persistent mistrust between communities that live in Kosovo. And by communities, I mean the majority Albanian community, the minority Serb community, and other ethnical communities such as Bosnians, Roma, Ashkali communities. The Western Balkans, in addition, is facing challenges from disinformation and foreign influence. This has been mentioned also before. External factors often exploit existing divisions, amplify mistrust, and undermine confidence in democratic institutions. This makes resilient and inclusive institutions even more important to have in Kosovo. In this context, women, peace, and security agenda is not about gender equality. It's about the stability in Kosovo, but also wider in the region. It's about social cohesion. It's about democratic governance in Kosovo. Despite policy progress, women in Kosovo remain still underrepresented in the decision-making institutions. And since I'm talking about women, peace, and security, I'm going to mention participation of women in security force, which is only at around 15%, and in Kosovo police, which is around 10%. We are still not at the percentage that we would want because the law on gender equality calls for 50-50% participation in all the decision-making areas. One notable gap is also women limited and inconsistent participation in Kosovo and Serbia dialogue that is mentioned. It is our only platform and the most important platform of cooperation and communication with Serbia for the time being is being facilitated by the EU. And the direct impact of that process, and that process would have, if implemented and handled correctly, will have a direct impact on the long-lasting peace in Kosovo. Another concern, which is very important to say, is the gradual reduction and fragmentation of international funding for women, peace, and security. It's also worth noting that this is not only happening to women, peace, and security agenda, but it's happening across all the human rights and women empowerment issue, not only with funding, but also with anti-gender narratives and the backtracking in the field of human rights and gender. Canada, I think, in this area can continue and can increase their meaningful participation and engagement. Canada has been a strong supporter of women, peace, and security globally. Continued support for women's civil society organization, leadership development, and women's participation in peace and security processes can help strengthen Kosovo. Canada can also continue to promote the meaningful inclusion of women in dialogue and decision-making processes and support efforts to build resilience against disinformation and polarization. Why does this matter beyond Kosovo? Because the stability of Western Balkans is not a regional concern. A stable Balkan is a stable Europe. The region's experience also demonstrates how inclusive peace building strengthens societies and helps prevent future instability.
Thank you.
Across the Western Balkans,
I will have to
yes.
stop you, unfortunately, because
Sure.
we're way over the time.
Sure.
And I hope you can cover some of the extra points
Yes.
during questions. I will now open the floor for questions, beginning with MP Michael Chong. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Some of our witnesses mentioned taking concrete steps to deepen presence in the region and talking about delivering tangible results in terms of diplomatic assets. So I want to ask a question about our embassies and consulates. I know we have an embassy in Croatia and Serbia, and consulates in North Macedonia and Albania, but nothing in Montenegro and Kosovo. It seems to me that of all those 6 states, that Montenegro is the closest to, of the 6 states in the Western Balkans, that Montenegro is closest to being admitted into the European Union. Is that a fair assessment? So that would suggest that the Canadian government should be looking at opening an embassy in Montenegro, because I believe we have embassies in all other member states of the European Union. Is that a fair conclusion?
Are you asking? Sure.
Both of you,
yes.
yeah.
Yes, I would say that's a fair conclusion.
I think that is a fair conclusion. I don't think that precludes the looking at opening an embassy in Kosovo as well. We're the only G7 country without an embassy in Kosovo. And although I would never think to discredit the amount of work that gets done by the ambassador of Canada to Kosovo, who was on the panel before mine, there is a limitation to how much you can get done through a cross-appointed embassy that without an in-residence ambassador.
You suggested in your testimony, by the way, that Canada should advocate for decoupling Kosovo's European Union aspirations from the normalization of relations between Serbia and Kosovo. Is that based on your view that coupling of those two issues actually provides an incentive for one of the state parties, to continue to meddle in the other state party?
I think it is based on that. It's also based on...
In order to prevent accession to the European Union?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the question. Thank you to the member. It is based on that. It's also based on the history of the last 5 to 10 years has shown that Serbia's government continues to be intransigent towards the European and international community, and towards Kosovo itself. This means that we've been in the same talks without making progress, and they use it. The government of Serbia uses it as an excuse to hold it over the relations with Kosovo.
Dr. Percival, do you share that view as well?
I perhaps have a broader perspective. I would say that that Kosovo also owes it to its Serbian minority population to ensure that they have safety and security. And the current government of Prime Minister Kurti, who I actually met when he was first released from prison 20 years ago, has not fulfilled their share of the obligations in terms of the protection of Serbian communities. But I also agree with my colleague that the role of Serbia in intervening in Kosovo is longstanding, and the current government in Serbia has definitely continued and perhaps accelerated that tradition.
Can you speak a bit about the national security and defense dimensions of Serbia with respect to NATO and with respect to Russia? I understand that there is some cooperation, military cooperation going on between Serbia and NATO. Can you speak to that a bit, and also speak to whether there's any military cooperation going on between Serbia and the Russian Federation?
I think, like in the previous panel, it was mentioned that there was recently a NATO exercise done with Serbia. And all of these are efforts to have Serbia turn towards the West instead of Russia. But as I and other experts would point out, that Serbia does this very intentionally. They will flirt with both sides. So they will take parts in these exercises and say what they need to Western countries, but then they will still have their ties to Russia, Russian oil, and continue rhetoric and public polling. Continued rhetoric by the government and public polling of the citizens shows that they will also continue to flirt with the side of Russia. So there are activities going on with the West and cooperation with the West, but I don't think that can reflect a actual and lived turn towards the Western nations?
This is a bit out of my area of expertise, but I would note that one of the side effects of the conflict in Ukraine, I think, has been a general weakening of Russia's ability to exercise its influence with Serbia, and so that presents an opening, I think, for countries like Canada.
Thank you. I'll just say that several years ago I read the book by Tim Butcher called The Trigger, and it was a real reminder about how history is so present in that region of the world, and so it was just something to note. So I appreciate your answers. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. We go next to MP Van den Belde. You have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. I wish we had a lot more time with all of you. And I have questions for each of you, but I'd like to start with Ms. Berishai Suleimani. Maria, it's good to see you again. And you spoke a lot about women, peace, and security, and we know that the former Yugoslavia is a very good example of both the worst and the best when it comes to women, peace, and security. I'd look at the Dayton Accord as a bad example. There were no women involved in that, and I think some of the instability of that accord now is probably a factor. So I note what you said about the dialogue between Serbia and Kosovo and the lack of women there, that we don't want history to repeat itself. But if you could perhaps give a little bit more, you said that there needs to be more investment. One of your recommendations was that Canada provide more support for the women, peace, and security efforts going on in the region. I know that there have been a lot of spontaneous platforms where women in Serbia, in Kosovo, Bosnia have come together on their own in order to facilitate dialogue in ways that maybe the formal processes have not been able to do. And I just wonder if you could talk a little bit more about what Canada could do to support that.
Thank you. Thank you, MP Van der Belt, for your question, and it's so good to see you. That's an excellent question, and you pointed rightfully so that even during the 90s, when there was a lot of ethnical tensions, and also during the war, civil society organizations, both from Kosovo and Serbia, women civil society organizations never actually stopped cooperating and participating in different. They kept basically the bridges of cooperation and communication open between the two societies. And you pointed rightfully so, this is something that we still should be basically focusing on and still be, let's say, investing in. That is the first thing. So basically we would be, this is the fourth pillar of the 1325, which is the prevention. So basically more investment in talking and dialogue between the civil society organizations from both countries, Kosovo and Serbia, would bring us closer to peace. On the other hand, it is very important. I also mentioned that Kosovo is developing a program for gender equality, and one of the pillars will be 1325. So basically, it is very clear with objectives and timeframes and what needs to be done. So basically, looking at that program, it's very important that the country knows what they want to achieve. So basically looking at the program and designated what is important in the program and supporting it, support to women participation in the security sector, in the security force, in police, but also supporting the dialogue between Kosovo Serb and Kosovo women, Albanian women, and also Serb women. But we also have to take into consideration, and somebody rightfully said before, that we also need to support the dialogue between women from different communities in Kosovo, because this is also something that would bring us peace, something that would create trust, and also on the long run would create more sustainable peace for Kosovo. And also one more thing, because you also said what would be interesting for Canada beside these two to invest. I think investing when it comes to countering disinformation and foreign influence, I think that investing in media literacy program and independent journalism are two of the very important programs in which Canada can invest. There is also the Kosovo Association of Journalists and the Network of Women Journalists who can be part of this support because they can help counter the disinformation and bring more stability to the region.
Thank you so much for that. And I know I don't have much time, but Dr. Percival, if you could talk about, you said there was an era that Canada punched above its weight, particularly in Kosovo, and you said engagement can enhance our status, it can do conflict prevention. Do you think Canada should be doing more in the region, more offices, diplomatic presence, perhaps more engagement with multilateral organizations like OSCE and others? Do you think we should do more?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. Yes, I would agree that we definitely should do more. There was a question about embassies in the region, and I think that we could learn a lot from fellow countries that have a lighter footprint. So when we open an embassy, it's very, very expensive, and we could have a lighter footprint and still a lot of influence. And I think the example of secondments to the OSCE, as well as, questions were raised about cybersecurity and other forms of countering foreign interference. Those are all areas that Canada has tremendous expertise.
Thank you. And Ms. Recha, you said you had some concrete steps that Canada could do, and you ran out of time. Could you please tell us that?
Thank you, Chair, for the question. Yeah, I mentioned that Canada's the only country without an embassy, so that's a concrete step. My second recommendation was capitalizing on goodwill and engendering more goodwill amongst the Kosovo government and Kosovo citizens. An example of that is visa liberalization. The EU it's been 2 years since the EU liberalized visas, and although there has been some minor drawbacks, overall it's been a success, and the problems that were forecasted never came to fruition. So Canada could engender goodwill with the country through and have more influence through EU visa liberalization. And as both my colleague Valerie Percival and yourself have mentioned, giving funding for paying secondments and making sure that we aren't the only country of our allies who don't have the same status within things like the OSCE.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to Monsieur Duceppe, I will ask Vice Chair Michael Chong to chair the rest of the meeting because I have to be back in the chamber to speak to a private member's bill that I'm sponsoring. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Duceppe. Vous avez.
Thank you, Mr. Duceppe. Brunel Duceppe, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. I hope Mr. Hussein will not disgrace the committee in the House with his statement. In your opening statement, Ms. Percival, I will quote you. You said we cannot forget our principles. That's a very important statement given a difficult geopolitical context. Are you not receiving the interpretation? Let's take a break for a few moments to make sure that the witness can listen. Are you hearing the interpreter? Are you hearing the interpreter now? Are you hearing the interpretation? Are you getting the interpretation? Are you getting the interpretation? Testing, testing, testing. Are you getting the interpretation? Testing, testing. It's important for everyone to understand what is going on, not only you. Is it working? Are you hearing the interpretation? Testing, testing. Are you hearing the interpreter? Is it working? Great. Let's start all over, Mr. Chair. Thank you. In your opening remarks, Ms. Percival, you said we cannot forget our principles given the geopolitical context we know, and in a context where, according to some experts, there's a hotspot in Europe. What did you mean when you used that statement that we shouldn't forget our principles?
That would be the principles of balancing the importance of civilian protection and national security, focusing on human rights, understanding how Canada can advance both our own national interests, but also ensure that we are building peace and stability in the region and ensure that we have a comprehensive approach.
Mais là, vous posez cette question.
You are asking that question, so to a certain extent, you have some fears because we are forgetting our principles. So why are you concerned? Is it because of government action, the opposition?
We lost our principles, but I am concerned in the current global environment and the current focus on national security. While I support fully the importance of supporting our military and increasing that support and using our military assets in places like Bosnia and Kosovo, I am concerned that when the focus is on build Canada strong, that we forget about our obligations globally. And so that is my concern.
Est-ce que, par exemple, le fait que...
For example, the fact that the government has cut international assistance aid or money, don't you see that this could have an impact on some programs that will no longer have any impact in the region we are talking about? Because it's not only Canada, you have the United States, other countries in Europe, Japan, and so on. So the international trend is that many governments are spending more in defense, and that is being tied to drastic cuts in international aid, whereas in our opinion, these should be two different envelopes, not interconnected. Don't you see this as a problem that unfortunately may have negative consequences when there are such cuts in programs?
And I have written about my concern about the decline in development assistance globally, including in areas like the Balkans. I think that development assistance is a tool that helps us project soft power, and support for diplomacy. In the last budget, there was a decrease in support for Global Affairs Canada, and we have not yet fully seen what the consequences of that decrease will be in terms of our diplomatic footprint. So it is a concern that I share, and I think that, I'll just leave it there.
On sait que, les Balkans...
We know that the Balkans is constituted by a diversity of language, culture, peoples, and so on. You demonstrated that eloquently. My question, you said it has always been a barometer. You said that in your opening remarks. To what extent are the Balkans still a barometer? Well, the importance of the barometer at some point, was it more important than today? Do you see a relationship or a difference in what happened in the past? Is the barometer you talked about still in place?
That, the Balkans is kind of, as I mentioned, a bellwether for global peace and security. And I think we have this situation where the scaffolding of the liberal international order, which was underpinned by the United States, is weakened. And I think you do see that in the Balkan region. And I think you do see the emergence of potentially a path forward, because you have the role of organizations like the European Union, you have Canada's continued engagement and hopefully enhanced engagement in organizations like NATO and the OSCE. So the Prime Minister has spoken about working with other middle powers, and I think that the Balkans could be an arena where that agenda could play out.
Merci beaucoup.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Brunet Duceppe.
Cody, you have 5 minutes for questions and comments.
Thank you, through you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming today. My question is for Professor Valerie Percival. Drawing from your expertise in research at the Norman Patterson School on Fragile States, Gender Inclusion, and Balkan Dynamics, where are the documented gaps in Canada's current response to authoritarian economic tools like the Belt and Road Initiative compared to other interference methods? And what evidence-based recommendations would you offer to strengthen democratic resilience and social inclusion across the region?
I think that that's an excellent question. I think that one of the things that we need to reflect on in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative is that it filled a gap, right? So that it provided, China provided, financing for infrastructure at a time when in some places that financing might not have been more readily available. I think also I would point to the COVID pandemic, where China provided vaccines when those vaccines were in short supply in other places. And I think that, the vaccines were not as effective as others, but it was a symbolic gesture. And I think that in terms of countering that influence, I think we need to that's a very big question. I think that we need to go back to kind of the fundamentals. I think having a presence in the region, having that diplomatic presence in the region, so we can identify how how other actors are engaging, in that kind of financing and support, how we can counter it, where the avenues are for our engagement. And I would support a lot of what my colleague said about the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I think that gender equality is something that has lost its appeal in the current global backlash against gender equality, but the evidence is 100% crystal clear that by supporting gender equality, by doing concrete things like ensuring labor force participation — Kosovo has the lowest labor force participation in Europe — that those are measures that can contribute to more peaceful societies.
Thank you. To continue, your research and teaching have long focused on fragile states, conflict prevention, and inclusive governance. China has already secured major infrastructure projects and financing across the Western Balkans through the Belt and Road Initiative, creating clear avenues for economic leverage and potential foreign interference. Serbia, in particular, has emerged as China's principal partner in the region, including a free trade agreement in 2024. In your view, how vulnerable does this leave the region to delayed or derailed Euro-Atlantic integration, and what critical gaps exist in Canada's current diplomatic and development response?
I think that's another excellent question. I think that countries in the region, and I think my colleague can probably speak to this in more detail, are weighing different countries off against each other, right? So I think that the European Union remains the key kind of gravitational force, right, in that region, which is helping to ensure economic security as well as national security. The role of the People's Republic of China is something to be concerned about. It's not an area that I have done extensive research in the Balkans, but I have seen it elsewhere, and I think that the role of China, particularly with debt, I think that's something that we're not really paying enough attention to, is the degree to which the level of debt can be exploited for geopolitical gain.
I'm not sure if you would like to answer this or one of the other witnesses, but to what extent does growing Chinese engagement in sectors such as infrastructure, energy, and telecommunications have on geopolitical or security implications?
Another excellent question, and a little tiny bit off outside of my wheelhouse, but I think that definitely it does have an impact, and I think the role of China in that space demonstrates that, one of the other areas of research has been Africa, and I think that the engagement of China in the Belt and Road Initiative did fill a gap and provided infrastructure in ways that Western donors just didn't do. And I think we have to reflect on that, and I think we also have to think about how important infrastructure is for, for economic growth and stability. Pardon
Okay,
me,
thank you very
Mr.
much.
Chair.
We'll now go to Monsieur Sari.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et vraiment un grand.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all those who are with us today. I have lots of questions because as I heard answers, I thought of other issues to ask you questions about, and I want to understand better. Let me start with Ms. Maria Berisha Siremani. Maybe give her more time. She talks a lot about disinformation when talking about gender equality. I would like to give you a few seconds or at the most 1 minute. How can we counter disinformation? A while ago, you started talking about it, but did you not complete your thoughts? I'll give you a few seconds before I ask questions to the others.
Thank you very much, MP Sari. As you said, that's a very important topic, and it's being talked across the whole Balkans. I mentioned, I think, very briefly when I was also giving the answer to MP van der Belt that investing in education, and this was also mentioned by one of the ambassadors in the first panel, especially in media literacy programs and also in independent journalism, is, I think, one of the most important to fighting disinformation and countering especially Russian influence. I also have to say that Russian influence comes through different portals and media outlets in Kosovo, which we don't know who owns them or where they come from, but it also comes mainly from Serbia, which is Russia's proxy in the region when it comes to their influence, to the influence in the security sector. So investing in education, I think, is something that, in this case, Canadian state, the embassy, closer to Kosovo people, first being that, and second, investing in programs of education, countering misinformation, media literacy, and independent journalism should be one of the main issues to counter disinformation and foreign influence, such as Russian influence. I also have to say one more thing. I was looking at the infrastructure projects. China has invested in all the Balkan states but Kosovo. So still we don't see a big Chinese influence in Kosovo, but Russian influence for sure.
Merci beaucoup. Et j'irai directement pour vous, Madame.
Thank you very much. Now, my question is for Ms. Krina Rizkash. When we want to engage in operations, there's usually misunderstanding. Researchers like you and the diaspora, what role can they play to have a better understanding of a country before they engage in operations there?
I think that I said what I am saying, when I say that we need to look at Kosovo as a pro-Western state, this doesn't mean that we aren't looking at the Serb diaspora. Diasporas are often people who can assess and be frustrated, but also pull levers in their own state. So I think the diaspora, both the Kosovar diaspora, the Albanian diaspora in Canada, and the Serbian diaspora in Canada can play important roles in also pushing their government towards a more pro-Western stance. And I really want to put that to the table, that it's not just about looking at the Kosovar and Albanian diaspora. The Serbian diaspora who lives in Canada also has a lot of goodwill towards the West and a goodwill towards Canada, and we can rely on them kind of as emissaries to speak, and diplomats within Canada to speak to their country and push towards a better policy as well.
Inaudible for the interpreter. Sometimes, could tensions on identity issues have an influence? A while ago, you talked about human safety. The issue of identity, could this have an influence as well? How can we better understand how to intervene when we are talking about identity issues.
You're asking about identity, right? And sorry.
Les tensions identitaires en anglais, c'est ça, c'est l'identité.
Yes. So
Tensions.
kind of that ethnic, reducing ethnic tensions is an area where Canada can engage more. I think that we could
How?
be. Sorry.
How?
Okay. Thank you.
Oh.
Just briefly, please.
Okay. I think we can draw on our experiences in Canada in terms of relations with Quebec and
Okay. Thank you very much. Monsieur Brunel de Sepp, vous avez 2 minutes et demi.
You have 2.5 minutes, Mr. Brunel de Sepp. Thank you, Chair. Ms. Resage, you said that several countries normalized relations with Serbia, and in your opinion, those countries are wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong, maybe Canada was on the sidelines when it came to normalizing relations with Serbia, but Canada was participating somewhat, even though it was on the sidelines. Could you please explain Canada's position when it comes to this desire to normalize relations with Serbia?
Normalization talks between Serbia and Kosovo are EU-led. The European Union is leading those talks. They're backed mostly by the United States, which is the main stakeholder and has been the main stakeholder. Canada hasn't had a very prominent role in that, other than taking, I would say, a passive role on the side of its allies, but it doesn't have a direct involvement in the EU-mediated talks, and it doesn't have the backing or pushing that U.S. politicians and U.S. diplomats do in Kosovo. So the point that I made is that Canada has an incredible amount of goodwill and history with Kosovo. So as Kosovars, Albanians, and Serbians, Kosovars, Albanians, Serbians, and other ethnicities within Kosovo, and also citizens in Serbia themselves are frustrated with the U.S. and the EU-backed talks, I think Canada can capitalize on its goodwill and take a more progressive and involved approach.
Et comment le Canada...
And how can Canada do that? Clearly knowing that the United States and Europe would like to act in a certain way, how can Canada come in and say, you are wrong? It's difficult for me to understand this honestly, without any prejudice. How can Canada interfere in the will of the United States and the EU, even if they are going down the wrong path? What is Canada's relative strength when it comes to this coalition? I'm talking about the EU and the United States.
In international forums, raised concerns about the way that Vucic's government is being accommodated, even while he's in transition to the international community. And then on the flip side of that, use their goodwill amongst the people of Kosovo and the people of Canada to support the talks. So behind closed doors in forums, raise their concerns and then openly support the talks and their allies.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Majumdar, and following that, Mr. Oliphant, at which point we will adjourn. So, Mr. Majumdar, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, sir. Listen, this first question is for Ms. Percival, and I apologize for massacring the name. I have a name that's difficult itself. Ms. Berishaj Stalyamani, am I pronouncing that correctly? Okay, winning. Well, listen, the question I have for you is related to Russian political and security influence. And in that, given Russia's enduring political, military, energy, and security ties to Serbia, and its support for hardline actors as Milorad Dodik and others, how is Moscow exploiting ethnic tensions and blocking progress on EU integration for Kosovo and Serbia normalization? What specific evidence exists of Russian hybrid activities, including disinformation, paramilitary training, or political financing, which we know is very problematic, that undermine both stability and human rights in the region? And how should Canada coordinate with allies on targeted sanctions, support for independent media and civil society, or diplomatic pressure to counter this without rewarding obstruction? I know it's a very small question.
It was all for me, right?
Yes, that's correct. Go ahead.
Please proceed.
Okay, thank you. First, you're completely right, because first I have to say that there is as you know, there is a Kosovo majority, which is Albanian population, and then there is a minority in Kosovo, which is Serb population. Serbian population that live in Kosovo are among 4 or 5%, and 95%. 92%, let's say, are Albanians, and there are also other minorities in Kosovo. Tensions are created because most of the Serb population in Kosovo lives in enclave and is directly responding to Vučić and Belgrade party. So basically, most of Serbs in Kosovo, unfortunately, don't consider Pristina to be their capital, but they consider Belgrade to be their capital. And most of people, Serbs in Kosovo, would rather listen to what Moscow will say and Belgrade will say rather than Pristina, which should be their capital, will say when it comes to what their integration should be, where their path should be. So basically, without having a meaningful integration of Serb minority community in Kosovo institutions, but also seeing Pristina as their capital and not as capital in Belgrade, we will have a lot of influence. Russia influences through different media. Russia influences through media that are in Serbia, but most of Serb population watches that media from Serbia in Serbian language. And it's basically translated news from Russia to Serbia in Serbian language. So people in Kosovo are basically are being informed by directly Russian sources and Russian bots through Serbian media.
Thank you very much. That's impressive that you were able to get through so much in such a brief time. Let me ask a quick follow-up, and then if I might, in the interest of that time. Russia and China are increasingly coordinating authoritarian tactics internationally, including in the information domain. To what extent are they using disinformation, cyber operations, or influence campaigns in the Western Balkans to inflame ethnic divisions, erode support for democratic reforms, EU, NATO aspirations, or target Kosovo's sovereignty and minority rights? I appreciate that this is pretty much a legacy of the late Richard Holbrooke, who I got to know a little bit before he had passed, but it certainly was a confusing mess that was left behind.
Yep. I think to a large extent, and not very directly. This is not something that you might see obviously, but if you track the science, you will basically be able to read it. And you mentioned one of the mingling directly with the elections in Kosovo. We still didn't see that, but we more saw it through the influence through Serbian list, which is the only Serb political party in Kosovo that operates. And 99% of Serbian population that works and lives in Kosovo votes for this party. And they're Vučić party, basically, which is a Russian proxy in Serbia. So this is a direct link if you want to see it. And also we have very good examples before, unfortunately, in Montenegro, when Montenegro had elections, when Montenegro was trying to join NATO, we had Russian influence directly influencing the referendum and these processes. On the other hand, I also have to stress this, and I said it also a little bit before, Chinese influence is not that much obvious in Kosovo. In other states in Balkans, yes, but Kosovo is still pretty good handling the Chinese influence when it comes to energy, infrastructure, soft powers, and others. So for this, I have to give to Kosovo government the credit.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for that answer, and we'll have our last round with Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. I want to delve a little bit on the so-called normalization issue, and I guess I'm a little less bleak or pessimistic about it than maybe our witnesses are. I want to talk about two areas. One, with respect to the Belgrade-Pristina, Pristina-Belgrade dialogue and what has stalled it and what could incentivize it to continue. And some have thought that EU membership in either Serbia or Kosovo could actually lead to that, and I understand it may not, but I want to just push a little bit harder on that dialogue and what we could do as Canadians to foster the dialogue. Not related to that, but not dissimilar, is the issue of the Peace Implementation Council, the PIC, the PIC, and the steering board, which Canada is a member on in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and the influences which have led to the High Representative stepping down. And so we have foreign influences that are not just Russia, that are not just China, but are also American. And we have foreign influences of Serbia manifesting in the minority populations in Bosnia-Herzegovina and in Kosovo. So I'm just wanting to get a little bit of thought on, A, what could incentivize the dialogue to be bumped up, and what role could Canada play in the north, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, with respect to the Peace Implementation Council. And I know that we have a bit more Kosovo experience, but maybe some Kosovo and some Bosnia-Herzegovina, and also from our witnesses online.
I'm happy to start. Thank you for the question. So 2 things that I think can further the normalization. The first is, as I said, decoupling the Kosovo's Euro-Atlantic integration from normalization, I actually think will make progress towards normalization. Because I think that if Kosovo starts making progress on its own merits towards Euro-Atlantic integration, the Serbian government will see that, and the Serbian populace will say, Kosovo's making progress towards Euro-Atlantic integration, we want to make progress too. So I think both countries are being stalled by it. The second thing, and related to that, is putting pressure on the government of Serbia when they are intransigent towards the international community and towards Kosovo Albanians, and continuing to put pressure on the government of Kosovo when they are intransigent towards the national community as well. At no point have I said today that the government of Kosovo is never an obstacle towards normalization of relations. I have only said that there cannot be an equivalency between the two. So both governments have been obstacles. So I actually think decoupling normalization from Euro-Atlantic integration will serve as an impetus for both countries to move forward.
And on the PIC, the PIC?
On the PIC, that's not my area of expertise, so I will defer.
Yeah, I only have worked tangentially on Bosnia, so I won't engage.
I see Miss Madame Berishaj Sulejmani
If I
has her hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, thank you. It's a bit challenging being online, so I hope I'm not interrupting. But what my colleague said previously, I just wanted to add something else. Clear European path for Kosovo and for Serbia, whoever is constructive in the dialogue, speeding up the process of the EU accession, I think that would speed up and incentivize people to be a bit more constructive in the dialogue. And also somebody mentioned before the sanctions towards Serbia. I think that also international community needs to be a bit more firmer when Serbia, let's say, is not honoring their commitments with the EU. And also you said it very rightfully so, it's not only Russian influence or, or Chinese. We have had the major change and shift in Bosnia. I'm sorry, we are talking about regionally, but it has been all over the news lately. We saw the change of the high representatives. It's all about, and also praising Dodic, and also trying to have, different political shift and movements in the region to accommodate certain business interests. So that's why I think that Canada stepping up in a more active and more constructive role and having a different approach than US at this stage would be that we have a friend across the Atlantic Ocean that wants a good thing for this region.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. Thank you very much to all 3 of our witnesses on this panel. Your testimony is valuable and will be, I'm certain, incorporated into a potential report. Without further ado, this meeting is adjourned.
Thank you, merci.